I had segment 4 of Chapter 1 Learning Theory, which is pages 27 to 34. The first section talks about tools for analyzing learning and behavior, and it explains that the learning theory is a lens through which all behavior can be viewed, and it recognizes the role of the forms of learning and how these forms interact. The book talks about Pavlov and how he investigated classical conditioning, which is called stimulus learning. And this was fundamental to adaptation in humans because it's the way that humans and animals anticipate and deal with what is expected to occur. This is significant because the animal learns to associate stimuli in its environment. And then Thorndike and Skinner researched instrumental conditioning, which is operant conditioning. And this allows animals to do things that lead to good consequences and avoid things that lead to bad consequences. So, for example, when a rat presses the lever to get food, it shows that the rat has learned the connection between the act and the outcome in operant conditioning. So, classical conditioning is when an animal behaves as if it's learned to associate a stimulus with a biologically significant event. So, the stimulus would be the S, and the biologically significant event is the S asterisk. And this is called S asterisk learning. Operant conditioning is when an animal behaves as if it's learned to associate a behavior or response. And this is with the R lever press with a biologically significant event. And this is called RS asterisk learning. So the difference between the two, classical conditioning is when the animal learns about the stimuli, but in operant conditioning, it's when the animal actually learns about the behavior. So one example that the book talked about was the crows foraging at the beach when they get the food, and this was Rito Zak, who watched the crows feeding on whelks, and he noticed their efficient behavior, and he found that it was very interesting that they only searched for food at low tide when the whelks were the most plentiful, and that they only took the shells that were the largest, that would break the easiest, and he concluded that this was just not to waste energy on the small shells that wouldn't break. And he also found it interesting that they dropped their whelks from an optimal height to minimize effort and to maximize the results. And the crows learned about stimuli and responses at the beach through the stimulus and response learning. These types of learning can also be associated with kids in play because all of children's play activities are governed by stimulus learning and response learning. So the textbook talks about the example of blowing bubbles. The child may first associate the bubble container with fun and excitement through stimulus learning, and then through response learning, the child actually learns how to dip the wand, bring it to his or her mouth, and blow the bubbles. Response learning and stimulus learning are always happening in combination, and they influence behavior. Another example is a child sucking on a pacifier, which is an operant behavior, but through stimulus learning, they generate excitement and reward associated with the sucking. Carolyn Rove Collier studied how babies learn and remember, and she found that babies ages 2 to 6 months whose foot were tied to a string that controlled a mobile when they kicked, they learned how to kick and make it move, and they could then recall that later on. She also concluded that infants' memory processing doesn't differ very much from older children and adults. Another example is people using drugs. People take drugs through response learning, and drugs can be seen as reinforcers. Lastly, the relations between SR and S asterisk. Any situation involving biologically significant events, S asterisk, involves an opportunity to associate S asterisk with both behavior, R, and stimulus, S, present in the environment. The direct association between stimuli and response, SR, elicits the response reflexively, and the repetition in practice becomes habitual behavior.